Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we talk about creating products rather than services. Hello and welcome to Advanced Studio Classroom. I'm your host, Joe. And yesterday, our first day of our business article, we were talking about the job hiring process, the difficulties, the questions that we have, sometimes the harsh truth that maybe we're not a good fit. But today we're switching gears. We're moving to a slightly different topic, which is about side hustles. And joining me today, we have once again Rebecca. Good to see you today, Rebecca.
Happy to be back for day 2.
And we also have Linda.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Rebecca. Great to be here.
Now, given the fact that we're talking about side hustles, and we define that word later on down in the article, but I think actually it's good to just sort of start with this point. And so, Rebecca, what's a side hustle?
A side hustle is something you do other than your job, but your side hustle usually can make you some money. Or some influence that you don't have from your ordinary job. So This is, a lot of people have side hustles in the United States or Canada. So after work, they might have a side hustle. Maybe they have another business. Maybe they sell things online. They have a side hustle.
Right. And definitely with online services, I feel like it's gotten a little bit easier to do that. And I feel like side hustle is kind of like a newer phrase. I don't know if I bumped into that.
Right. I haven't really heard this commonly used because before, hustle had a negative connotation.
Yeah.
Like if, you're a hustler, like that wasn't really something that was thought of positively.
But now I feel like this kind of term, it's not really a negative or a positive thing. It's just sort of what we used to refer to as a side job.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
So it's neutral.
Neutral term. And so I wanted to ask our wonderful panelists, what would be your side hustle? Now, we're all busy at Studio Classroom. We're doing a million billion different things because, as we know, we have Rebecca, she's doing business stuff, and Linda, you're doing Let's Talk stuff, and I do Let's Talk stuff. But let's just imagine in a world where we had a little extra time.
Right. And that we were allowed to. So ideally, I guess my side hustle might be doing writing, like other than, our magazine writing, maybe writing about my travels, like doing travel writing and, trying to sell that, sell those stories.
Right. Kind of having maybe like a travel writing blog or,
Or writing for a publication, but just on the side, maybe like doing a piece every so often.
Hey, you could get your travel articles done in Advanced Studio Classroom, considering we do so much about traveling in our magazine.
That's true, but you won't get paid extra for it. Yeah. And that's the idea of the side hustle, that you make extra money through your after-job job.
Your after-job job. So, Rebecca, let me ask you, what would be your after-job job? What would be your side hustle?
I think if I could do a side hustle, maybe I would do translation or interpretation because I've been an interpreter for many years. So I think I could interpret like at events or gatherings. I'd be happy to do that.
You'd be like at a conference or something like that.
Sure. And it challenges your brain because there's so many different topics. It might be tech. It might be medicine. I mean, you really expand your knowledge when you do interpretation.
Right. Actually, one of my favorite examples of a side hustle, I have a friend in the United States who's a high school teacher. His side hustle is he sells donuts.
He sells donuts?
He makes donuts and sells them.
Oh, he makes them?
He makes donuts.
Oh, okay.
He's not just going to like Krispy Kreme or something and then buying the donuts and selling it somewhere else. He makes his own donuts.
That sounds really fun.
And so I think that would be kind of a fun side hustle.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do? Well, I make donuts.
I think I can't do that, though, because I'll gain a lot of weight. I'll probably eat half the donuts.
Well, I think this is a good question, and, it's a nice thing to think about, especially if you're looking to build your own business, but you're too afraid to sort of step away from your main job and start to do that on your own. Starting as a side hustle might be a good fit for you. And with that in mind, I think it's a good time to get our first reading. 3 reasons to create a product rather than a service. When you start your first business, you start with what you know, and that's a great impulse. For a lot of us, that's a service. Something we think we can provide to the world that doesn't already exist. But there are a few reasons why you should think about turning your business into a product. 1. A product is perfect for a side hustle. Many entrepreneurs start with a side hustle because they have great ideas they want to work on the side. America is captivated by the side hustle. Most of those businesses are products. So you want to start your first business. And how do you get started, Rebecca?
Well, usually how do you get started is you just start.
You just start.
You have to have an idea. You first need to have an idea for a product or service, and then you start working on it.
Right. And we start with what we know.
Exactly. We start with what we know because, that would be best. You don't want to start with something that you don't have any idea about. Then,
Right. That would be kind of difficult. If you have zero ideas about how to fix cars, perhaps you shouldn't start your own, being a mechanic at a shop.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so starting with what you know, it's a great impulse. And so impulse here is, it's just something that's kind of that force. It's a good reason for doing something. You start with what you know.
Right, your motivation, why you want to start your own business.
Right, and so here, apparently for a lot of us, and I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I could imagine it being so, it's starting with a service, Rebecca.
Yeah, some of the side hustles we mentioned earlier are actually services. For example, if I did interpretation, that's a service.
Right.
That's not really a product. You don't make a product out of it. It's a service. It takes up your time. It might take up several hours of your time at a time.
Right. And I guess the travel writing would also sort of fall under, you're creating a product, but it's also very labor intensive.
Right. So in both of our side hustles, we're very much directly involved.
The high school teacher with the donut making, if he could get a donut making factory, he might be okay.
That's right.
Might be a product.
He could give it to someone else to do.
There we go. And so we start with this service, something we think of that we can provide that doesn't already exist, or something that we do really well at, of course. But there are apparently reasons why we should be focusing more on a product for a business, Rebecca.
Yeah, we're going to go on to talk about why product is a good idea because, a key thing is the product, it doesn't have to be just you. Other people can work on the product. But if you do a service, you basically you're completely wrapped up in it. You cannot get yourself away from the service.
Right. I have a friend who's a freelance writer, speaking of writers, and his challenge is always how much can I reasonably take on? Because, I don't have a second person who's also a writer. And so that's kind of a struggle, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and that can be kind of difficult. But apparently a product is perfect for a side hustle, Linda.
Right, because America seems to be captivated by side hustles, and a lot of these businesses are products.
Right, and so here, we're going to be talking for the rest of the lesson about why products tend to be more important, why products tend to be better than doing the service route. And, it's interesting here, we've talked about side hustle, what it is, and why people are so interested in it. But the main question here for our lesson today is why products are better than services. So we're going to get the first reason for that now. Two, products are easier to scale. Scaling a service where you are intimately involved is difficult without experiencing some kind of drop-off in your personal productivity. A great example of a product right now is Bird. They are incredibly hands-off in their approach. It's basically, here are some scooters, and we think you'll use them. They drop them off, they do some light maintenance and battery repair, and everything else gets handled automatically through their app. So the better way of defining a product versus a service is that you're looking to create something for which you can eventually be hands-off and it will still work. So products are easier to scale. So this is our first kind of key point here. And what does it mean to scale, Linda?
So as you develop something, you're going to adjust it or balance it so that it suits the needs of your customers or for whatever purpose you want it for. So products will be easier to scale than, let's say, services.
Right. And so here, we talk about sort of scaling up as you get maybe higher demand for what you're building or what you're doing. You're able to provide more products. So you have that way of scaling.
Yeah, and usually in the startup world, they love the word scaling or to scale up because that means if you want to grow something big, like you want to make more money, you want more influence, then you need to scale it up, which means you just need to have more products. You need to make it bigger, have more revenue.
Right, because if you're doing the service approach, what's the problem, Linda?
Well, you are intimately involved in the service. And so if you want to adjust it or, scale it, then that's going to lead to some kind of drop-off in your personal productivity.
Oh, and this is also a really good way of, phrasing this, a drop-off.
Drop-off is to decrease, a big decrease. So if your productivity drops off, it just means that your output becomes less and less. Because let's say you already work a full-time job, like a 9-to-6 job, and then you're doing a side hustle from like 8 to 11. But I can only take on one project at a time. So eventually my output is going to decrease.
Right.
And maybe my real job also will suffer.
Right. All of a sudden, you're just sort of like overwhelmed by the amount of things you have to do.
Right. And so being able to, increase or keep a steady productivity is going to be difficult.
Yeah, because, if we think about, for instance, in the Linda being a travel writer example, at some point, you have to actually travel to the places and write the articles and edit them. And at some point, if you want to keep writing articles, it gets more and more difficult.
Right. So, and you would need to make time. But there are only 24 hours in a day.
And there's only one Linda. So.
That's right. You cannot copy Linda. You can't put her in the copy machine and out comes 10 Lindas.
Yeah,
although that would be
cloning.
really handy.
It would, but
so we get into an example of a product that, from the writer's perspective, does this whole scaling thing pretty well. And so the product that they're talking about here is this kind of scooter. And, it's a company called Bird. You can look them up. The point isn't necessarily about the company, but about the way they do it. So what kind of approach do they have, Rebecca?
Well, we use the term here hands-off. So when you have something that is hands-off, it means you're not directly involved. You're kind of, you let others do the work or let others do the decisions. And how is Bird hands-off?
Well, so basically, when it comes to hands-off and how they do this, they have a whole setup that apparently seems pretty convenient. Like if you're running Bird, actually the amount of work you have to do isn't too bad.
Right, because a lot of it is automated or outsourced to other people.
Right, and so down here it kind of talks about that whole process where Bird, this scooter company, they drop the scooters off, they do some little bits of maintenance, kind of fixing some things, some battery repair, and then everything else gets handled automatically through their app. And actually, this sounds like a bunch of services. I feel like there's
there's a lot of services like that. Like in our part of the world, we have like scooter rental like this too. And of course for bikes, like bike sharing, like whether in China or other places, there's a lot of bike sharing apps, which is exactly this concept. You can use an app, you can order the bike or you could pick up the bike and then you pay for it using the app. And then if there's any problem with the bike, that company has to fix it.
Right. And so basically, they're not really that involved. And actually, I know companies like this will sometimes still say that they're actually more of like a tech company. I feel like Uber does some stuff like this. Where
it's really more like a tech company because they're not really actively involved. Like they don't make the scooters, for example. They buy the scooters from somebody else. And they're not really fixing the scooters because, like Linda was saying, they outsource this to other people. Other people will fix the scooters if needed. So they're basically doing the coordination or the logistics of getting the scooter to you and then making sure the scooter is running properly.
Right. That sounds quite hands-off.
Yeah. And at the end of this sentence, it says that everything else, gets handled through the app. Like, simple.
Right. So I would think that, a hands-on approach, that opposite, would look something like, oh, I personally am delivering this scooter to you, and I'm personally going and fixing the scooter, and I'm doing this and doing that. So all of a sudden, now that sounds more like a service versus a product.
That's right. Like when you think of that as a service, you can think of maybe like fashion. Because like fashion, if you want personalized fashion, like for example, a lot of the fashion houses, like for example, they would design something for a Hollywood star. Everything is custom made. Like there is nothing that can be automated. Everything has to be looked over and decided by the fashion designer.
Right, versus a more automated process.
Right. And I just want to mention another use of this term hands-off. You can also use it to describe a management style. If the manager is hands-off, like he or she doesn't get really involved in, their employees' work. They kind of leave them on their own, let them be independent, and they don't interfere that much. So a lot of managers will take this approach versus a more hands-on approach.
Right, yeah. So that's a good point. So it's not just about business models. It's also about maybe even a leadership style. You can see that kind of usage. And so here it says the better way of defining a product versus a service is that you're looking to create something for which you can eventually be hands-off and it will still work. And I think that this is a really fair point about how you can try to make a stronger product.
Yeah, you have to, when you're thinking of your side hustle, you really need to think, how can I make a side hustle where I'm not spending all my time in this?
And this is something that's actually really important, I think, for entrepreneurs is this idea of, okay, if my company gets bigger, what am I going to do?
Right. I mean, this is the ideal, right? That you create something and then you can eventually sort of, let it just operate on its own. Yeah. And I don't know, I can kind of equate this maybe to parenting. Like when you have a child and, you nurture this child, you raise them, you give them education, but eventually you want to let your child go into the world and be independent and you can be hands-off.
Hands-off.
That's actually a really good analogy.
It really is. You guys are so good, you ladies, are so good at making great analogies for our topics the past 2 days. Now, Linda's point about getting to be more hands-off leads right into the next point about why a product might be better than a service. 3. It's easier to make an exit with a product. It's hard to walk away from a service where you are involved daily, but a product can be sold at any time. The entrepreneur learns that the product is easier to exit from and has more long-term potential. There is a common life cycle to entrepreneurship. The earlier you can understand how to navigate the life cycle, the more successful you will be. Merging your expertise with what's currently working for you is a good first step. Challenge yourself to create a business that needs you at first, but won't always need you. Tastes will change, technology will change, your ideas will change, and part of entrepreneurship is always being willing to adapt. And so we have this point here where it's easier to make an exit with a product. And why might that be the case, Rebecca?
Well, because you can hand it off to someone else. Like if you're very successful, you can sell off your product.
Right, so you're selling it. Whereas a service doesn't really work that way.
Right. It's going to be harder to walk away if you are involved in that service every day or you have some sort of direct involvement with it.
Right. And so basically, if that service or whatever you're doing requires you to be the person doing it, at some point you're going to sort of hit a wall, a limit of what you can do. And we had talked about that as sort of the drop-off in your personal productivity.
Exactly.
And so here we talk about how, a product can be sold at any time. And so the entrepreneur learns that the product is easier to exit, and there's something else that's also good about products.
It has more long-term potential. And why does it have more long-term potential? It's because the product can scale. It can grow. And you're not just making a little bit of money. You make more and more money over time.
Right. And so when it says here that it's easier to exit from and it's got that long-term potential, we think of something that can actually last maybe even longer than the person themselves.
Exactly. And it's something maybe you could mass produce, Because if you're just one person doing a service, then like we mentioned earlier, you can't mass produce yourself or you can't copy yourself.
Right.
Unless you have other people, but then, it's becomes too labor intensive that way. Mm-hmm. But if you have a product, then, that's something that you can scale better and, yeah.
Right. You can kind of scale that and get that adjusted so that you actually don't have to be doing that service every single day.
Right.
And so here they talk about, there's a common life cycle to entrepreneurship. But first of all, I want to talk about, why do they use the phrase like life cycle, Linda?
That's a good analogy. Yeah, like being an entrepreneurship too, like there is a life cycle to being an entrepreneur. And I guess that's from, you start from your startup and you grow it and then eventually you want to let it go like we talked about in the last point. You want to be able to step back.
Right, step back and away from that. And we often talk about life cycle a lot with businesses, actually. Even products have life cycles,
Yeah,
Rebecca.
we say products have life cycles. Like perhaps in the past, before we had mobile phones, like we were like using a lot of time on our computers. So computers have a life cycle. Like the computer industry had a life cycle. Now I would say the computer industry, it's in its senior years. Like we still need computers, but they're just not as central to our lives as perhaps as mobile devices. So the mobile devices, we could say that category, maybe it's in the middle age years. There's a life cycle. It's very much a term that was first used in biology, where we have the birth and then the maturity. Something grows into maturity, and in the end, it will eventually die or end. So a lot of startups or products or companies also have a life cycle. Like what they provide today might not be needed 30 years from now.
Right, of course. And it's so hard to predict what we're going to be needing product-wise in the future.
That's true.
And that's true. Startups also sort of have their life cycle where, you have different phases and different things that you're doing depending on exactly where your company is in that life cycle. And now apparently there's kind of a benefit to understanding this life cycle and knowing what to do with it.
Right, because the earlier you understand, how to navigate this life cycle, the more successful you will be.
And I think this is a good point. And I think that's true of a lot of life. Like the more you know of how to navigate your way through things, whether it's like yesterday with a hiring process or with this, you'll just be more successful.
That's true.
And I know that can be often a little bit difficult because you have to do a lot of sort of research up front.
Yes, the learning process can be difficult.
Right. We talk about like a learning curve, even that sort of thing. And especially when you're sort of building a product, understanding that life cycle and that scaling process can definitely yield really great benefits.
Yes, because then you know what you're supposed to be doing at every stage. Because if you really do treat your product like a child, it needs to grow. It cannot be at the same stage for the next 5 years.
And so here we kind of get this next tip, which is, merging your expertise with what's currently working for you is a good first step. And what are they talking about with expertise here, Linda?
Your knowledge and skills. So what you're good at. So taking that and then just combining that with something that is working today or will work for you. So putting those things together.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really hard piece of advice because my expertise do not lead to any sort of side hustle products. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not sure what I would do with this piece of advice.
The truth is, I think we all have our expertise. The only problem is a lot of our expertise is service related. And it's not so easy to come out with a product that does not need us all the time.
Right.
And that's the difficulty because I think if a lot of us could come out with an amazing product, then we would be out there doing that product right now.
Of course, right? I mean, it's like, oh, well, I wouldn't be in this room. No.
That's right.
But I do think, if you're sort of trying to find something that you want to do in the future, I think starting, for instance, as a hobby, like learning about how to build something as a hobby, building apps or whatever as a hobby, and then sort of working your way up and figuring out what works for you in that way is a good starting point. Because I think a lot of us don't necessarily know what our expertise is if we're just sort of sitting as an office worker.
That's true.
And I think that's really difficult. But we get sort of the final closing thought for today's article, Linda.
Right. And that you should be willing to adapt. Adaptability is very, very important.
And I think this, of course, is also another kind of piece of hard advice because what ends up happening, I think, is that, you get your idea, you start to build it, but then the environment that your idea is in is sort of changing what people are expecting. And that can be hard, too.
Yeah, that's really hard. So, no matter what business you're in, you have to keep changing. Here at Studio Classroom, we started out just radio. When our founder, Doris Brom, started, it was only radio and a two-piece page of handout that went with the radio program. And then we went into TV. And then over the years, we've gone into digital. You can find us online on our website in many different places, on apps. And today, you can see us throughout many social media platforms. And we still have to keep changing to be relevant to people who want to learn English in this generation.
Right. And actually, as an ending point, I think that's maybe an interesting idea of how you take a service and turn it into a product. Because the service is the English teaching, but the product is actually these magazines that you're making or TV programs that you're making. So you're sort of taking what could just be a service and making it into a product.
Yes.
And here we are, making a product.
That's right. A radio program is a product, too.
I feel like maybe. Now, as we start to close from our lesson, I just wanted to maybe ask our panelists, is there anything from the past 2 days that we've had that just stuck out to you? Any little kernels of knowledge that you got from our past 2 days, just real quick?
I think for me, the key word here is adaptable, because whether it was today we're talking about our products have to adapt to the changing times. Yesterday, we were talking about being adaptable as well, because one of the three things in the holy trinity of hiring, personality, aptitude, and experience, the second one, aptitude, is really about learning and being able to adapt and change.
How about you, Linda? Little Colonel?
I liked the phrase, finding your tribe.
Finding your tribe.
Just letting go, not letting the rejection affect you negatively, but learning from that and using it to help you find where you belong.
That's wonderful. And I think these are both really good points from our business article for this month's magazine. And I want to encourage you to take some time, look at Topic Talks, try to review a little bit, and feel free to send us a little feedback, comments about what you think about today's lesson. And I've been your host, Joe.
Rebecca.
Linda.
Saying goodbye.
Bye.